They called my flood wall an eyesore. I built it after losing everything once before. The HOA slapped me with fines and a lawsuit threat. Neighbors laughed, calling it my paranoid concrete monster. I almost tore it down just to belong again. Then the sky turned black for 3 straight days. The woman who mocked me had been stealing our flood fund for years. By midnight, she was pounding on my door, begging me to let her family inside. My name is Daniel Reyes, structural engineer, 38 years old. My wife Mara and our daughter Lily moved to Willow Creek Estates 2 years ago, chasing a quiet cul-de-sac, good schools, and a river view we thought was a blessing. I designed bridges for a living. I never imagined my own house would become my hardest project. Willow Creek sat in a bend of the Sabine Fork, postcard pretty in summer, deceptively calm most of the year. The HOA ran the place like a kingdom of manicured lawns and beige mailboxes, presided over by a woman named Sandra Voss, who smiled with her teeth and never with her eyes. Sandra had chaired the HOA board for 11 years, longer than anyone could remember voting her in twice. She controlled the newsletter, the fine schedule, the architectural review committee, and, most people whispered, the reserve fund nobody ever saw an itemized statement for. Questioning her felt like questioning gravity. The county had flagged our neighborhood as flood-prone twice in the last decade. Quietly, in documents nobody read. Willow Creek had flooded once before I arrived, back when the development was new, and the story got buried under new sod and a ribbon cutting for the community pool. I knew flood water. Own living room when I was 14, in a town 2 states over, because nobody believed the levee could fail until it did. That memory lived in my spine, not my head. I checked river gauges the way other men check sports scores. Sandra's late husband, Harold, had been the original developer's contractor. Neighbors spoke of him fondly, a builder who got things done fast and cheap. Nobody asked what corners fast and cheap required. The original drainage culverts under Maple Bend Road were, I would later learn, half the size the county blueprints demanded. For 2 years I lived in blissful ignorance like everyone else, mowing my lawn on Saturdays, waving at Sandra's cheerful welcome wagon baskets, believing the HOA's endless bylaws about mailbox color and fence height were merely annoying, not dangerous. Then, in March, the county sent a floodplain reassessment letter to every household. Mine arrived stamped urgent. It listed Willow Creek as sitting inside a newly expanded 100-year floodplain, thanks to upstream development that had stripped wetlands acting as natural sponges for decades. I brought the letter to an HOA meeting, expecting concern, maybe a task force. Sandra read it aloud in a bored voice, then folded it in half. The county exaggerates every spring, she said, smiling at the room. We've never flooded on my watch. Everyone nodded like she'd said something true. I pressed, gently, asking if we could fund a drainage engineering study. Sandra reminded the room, sweetly, that reserve funds were earmarked for community beautification projects, including the new stone entrance sign everyone had voted for last year without knowing its actual cost. Walking home that night, Mara asked what I thought. I told her the culverts under Maple Bend looked undersized to my trained eye, and that stripped wetlands upstream meant more water reaching us faster. She squeezed my hand and said, "Then we protect our house. Forget the HOA." I pulled county floodplain maps, elevation surveys, and rainfall projection models that weekend, spreading them across our dining table like blueprints for a bridge that had to hold. Our lot sat lowest on the block, closest to the drainage swale that fed straight into the Sabine Fork. I designed a flood barrier the way I designed everything, conservatively, with margin for the worst case rather than the average one. A reinforced concrete wall, 4 feet high, wrapping the low side of our property, tied into engineered footings rated for hydrostatic pressure the county's own tables specified. I filed the permit with the county first, the proper way, the way Harold Voss apparently never had. The floodplain administrator approved it within 2 weeks, noting in writing that my design exceeded the minimum requirement for our zone. I felt, for the first time in months, like I could breathe. I still needed HOA architectural approval, a formality, I assumed, since the county had already blessed the engineering. I submitted the plans with photos, calculations, and the county approval letter attached, expecting a rubber stamp within the standard 30-day review window everyone quoted like scripture. Weeks passed with silence. I emailed twice, with a single line. The committee has concerns about aesthetic compatibility with neighborhood character. I read it 3 times, certain I'd misunderstood. A safety wall, rejected over paint swatch logic, while flood letters sat unopened in half the mailboxes on my street. Mara warned me not to push too hard, said Sandra had run off 2 other families with fines over trivial things. A wrong shade of shutter, a garden gnome deemed unauthorized decor. I told her this was different. This wasn't decor. 11 feet from the swale. I started construction anyway, county permit in hand, confident the law was clearly on my side. The concrete trucks arrived on a Tuesday morning, and by noon half the cul-de-sac had gathered on the sidewalk, phones out, whispering like I'd parked a circus tent on my lawn. Sandra showed up in her golf cart before the first pour had even cured, clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield. Daniel, sweetheart, you cannot just build whatever you like, she said, loud enough for the gathering crowd. This is a community, not a bunker. I explained calmly that county code superseded HOA aesthetic guidelines when it came to life safety flood mitigation. Sandra's smile tightened at the edges. We'll see what the board says about that, she replied, and turned her golf cart around without waiting for my response. By that evening, an official cease and desist notice was taped to my front door, citing Article 7, Section 3 of the Covenants regarding harmonious exterior modifications. I photographed it, laughing bitterly, wondering if harmony mattered more to these people than whether their children drowned in their sleep. Mrs. or normally sweet, sent a text saying my wall of shame was already dropping her home's curb appeal, according to her real estate agent friend. I stared at the message a long time, struck by how quickly fear of losing property value could override basic self-preservation. At the next emergency board meeting, Sandra opened by projecting a photo of my half-built wall onto the wall of the clubhouse, captioned in bold red letters, "Not approved." The room gasped theatrically, as if I'd erected a monument to bad taste instead of a barrier against drowning. I stood and presented my county approval letter, my engineering calculations, the floodplain map showing our lot's elevation. Sandra cut me off twice, insisting the board only cared about process, that I'd gone around proper channels, ignoring that her own committee had ignored my submission for 6 weeks straight. A man named Rick Hoyt, second in HOA seniority and Sandra's closest ally, moved to fine me $500 a week until the wall came down or received proper aesthetic review. The motion passed 6-1. Only old Mr., retired and mostly ignored, voted against it. Walking to my car afterward, Mr. Delgado caught my arm. "Boy, I was on this board when Harold Voss cut those drainage pipes in half to save money," he murmured. "Sandra knows exactly what that river can do. Watch yourself." Then he shuffled off before I could ask him anything more. I didn't sleep that night, turning Delgado's words over like a stone with something sharp underneath. If Sandra knew the real flood risk, her aggressive opposition to my wall stopped looking like vanity and started looking like something closer to fear, or worse, something closer to guilt. The fines started arriving weekly. Official letterhead, itemized like invoices from a business that hated me personally. $500 became $2,000 within a month. I kept building anyway, brick by brick,
pour bail pour,
refusing to let a spreadsheet decide whether my daughter lived or died. Lily, 7 years old, asked me one night why Miss Sandra didn't like our new wall. I told her some grown-ups worry more about how things look than whether they work. She thought about that for a moment, then said, "That's a silly way to be a grown-up," and went back to her cereal. Someone spray-painted eyesore across the unfinished concrete one Sunday morning while we were at church. Mara cried in the driveway, not from the vandalism itself but from the realization that our neighbors, people who'd brought us casseroles when we moved in, now saw us as the enemy. I reported it to the county sheriff's office, more for the record than any real hope of an arrest. The deputy who came out recognized the address instantly. "Willow Creek," he said, shaking his head. "We get called out here more than you'd think. Mostly HOA nonsense dressed up as vandalism." Sandra sent a neighborhood-wide email that week, framing my unsightly barricade as a threat to property values for the entire street, encouraging neighbors to voice their concerns at the next meeting. 40 people showed up, more than I'd seen at any HOA event in 2 years. I brought printouts of the county's flood expansion letter for everyone that night, offering copies at the door. Most people waved them off, unopened, more interested in Sandra's slideshow titled, "Preserving Our Community's Vision," which somehow featured 3 photos of my house and none of anyone else's. A young couple, the Ferraros, pulled me aside afterward, whispering that their own insurance agent had just raised their flood premium citing the same county reassessment. They didn't dare say it publicly. They admitted, because Sandra had fined the last person who challenged her nearly $8,000 over a fence dispute. That night I filed a formal appeal with the county against the HOA's cease and desist, attaching every document I had. The clerk told me appeals like mine typically took 90 days to schedule a hearing. 90 days. Cast for spring storms and felt the calendar tightening around my throat. The lien notice arrived first, taped crookedly to my mailbox, threatening to attach itself to my home's title if the fines went unpaid past 30 days. I called a lawyer that afternoon, a woman named Priya Nair who specialized in HOA disputes and answered her own phone, which I took as a good sign. Priya read through everything in 20 minutes and let out a low whistle. Your county approval overrides their aesthetic clause for anything classified life safety, she said. But HOAs bank on people not having the money or stamina to fight. That's their whole business model. Frankly, I asked what it would cost to fight properly. Her answer made Mara go quiet at the kitchen table that night. The two of us doing math on a napkin, weighing legal fees against the price of watching our daughter's room fill with river water while lawyers argued about zoning language. Sandra escalated by posting my fine total on the community bulletin board outside the mailroom. A printed spreadsheet with my address and balance owed. An act Priya said bordered on defamation but would take months and money to prove in court. Money we didn't exactly have to spare. Old mister, raking leaves one evening and lowered his voice again. Ask her sometime where the reserve fund actually went, he said. 10 years of dues. And we still don't have proper storm drains. But somehow there's always money for a new fountain at the entrance. I filed a records request with the HOA management company for 5 years of financial statements, a right explicitly granted under state HOA transparency law. Sandra's assistant stalled me for 3 weeks, citing administrative delays, before finally sending a PDF so heavily redacted it looked like a ransom note. Rick Hoyt cornered me at the mailboxes, all friendly smiles and terrible intentions. You know, Daniel, this could all go away, he said. Drop the appeal, tear down that eyesore, and I bet the board forgives every fine. Fresh start. I asked him why they cared so much. He didn't answer. That offer told me more than any document could have. Nobody offers to erase $8,000 in fines over a paint color. Sandra wasn't fighting for aesthetics. She was fighting to keep something buried. And my wall, standing where it stood, was somehow shining a light directly on it. I started quietly researching Sandra Voss herself, the way I'd research a failing structure, from the foundation up. Public records showed she'd purchased a lake house in a neighboring county 18 months earlier. Cash. No mortgage recorded. An odd luxury for a woman whose only listed income was a part-time real estate license. Mara worried I was becoming obsessed, chasing conspiracy instead of just finishing the wall and enduring the fines. I told her I wasn't chasing anything. I was documenting everything. The way you document a crack in a foundation before it becomes a headline about a collapsed building. The Ferraros invited us over quietly one night, blinds drawn like we were smuggling contraband. They'd heard from a friend on the county assessor's staff that Willow Creek's HOA had submitted grant paperwork years ago for a federal drainage improvement match, then never completed the required local matching funds. That grant, apparently, would have doubled the culvert capacity under Maple Bend Road, the exact bottleneck I'd flagged in my own calculations. It expired and used 3 years ago. Nobody in the neighborhood had ever heard about it, because nobody outside the board had ever seen the minutes where it was discussed. I requested those specific board minutes under the transparency law, citing the statute number Priya had given me. This time Sandra herself replied, not her assistant, her tone icy through the screen. Certain minutes are protected as confidential board deliberations, she wrote.
I'd advise you focus on...
Priya laughed out loud reading that email over the phone. That's not how confidentiality works for financial matters in this state, she said. She's stalling because she knows exactly what's in those minutes. And she's betting you won't have the stomach to force it in front of a judge. The next board meeting turned into an ambush disguised as routine business. Sandra proposed a new bylaw requiring unanimous board approval for any structure exceeding 30 inches in height. Worded so specifically it could only have been drafted with my 4-foot wall in mind. I stood to speak and Rick Hoyt cut the meeting's public comment period short by motion, seconded instantly by a board member I'd never even seen at a prior meeting. The vote passed. Already permitted by the county, was now retroactively illegal under a rule invented that same evening. Walking out, a woman I didn't recognize touched my sleeve in the parking lot. She introduced herself as Denise, Sandra's former assistant, fired 2 years back under circumstances she wouldn't discuss in the open. "Keep pushing," she whispered.
There are people who want to see this.
I didn't sleep well that week, running numbers in my head that had nothing to do with concrete tolerances. Denise's warning sat beside Delgado's warning, beside the missing grant, beside the cash-purchased lake house. Each fact a rivet in a frame I could feel taking shape but couldn't yet see whole. Mara found me at 2 in the morning at the kitchen table, surrounded by printouts. "You look like you did after your dad," she said softly, meaning the year I spent researching levee failures obsessively after the funeral. I told her this time, at least, I could actually do something before the water came. The county appeal hearing date finally arrived on the calendar, scheduled for late in the month, still weeks away. Priya warned me the HOA would likely send a lawyer to argue community aesthetic harm, a phrase so absurd against a wall built to prevent drowning that I almost laughed reading her email. Sandra sent a mass newsletter framing the upcoming hearing as Daniel Reyes versus the community, inviting neighbors to submit written objections to the county on my wall's visual and emotional impact. 43 letters were submitted. I read every one, feeling less like a neighbor and more like a defendant. Not every letter was hostile. 3. And signed. Simply read, "Some of us know what really happened with the drainage grant." Not everyone believes her. I stared at those unsigned notes longer than any of the angry ones, wondering who among my neighbors already knew the thing I was only beginning to suspect. My daughter came home from a playdate crying because another child had repeated, verbatim, an adult's line, "Your daddy's ugly wall is going to make everyone's house worth less." I held her on the porch steps a long time, furious in a way I hadn't let myself be since my father's funeral. That night I made a decision. I would keep building, keep documenting, keep fighting through proper channels. But I would also start quietly reaching out to other homeowners who'd been fined or bullied under Sandra's tenure, gathering their stories the way you gather load data before a structural report. 6 families responded within a week, each with their own version of the same story. Disproportionate fines, mysterious redacted financials, sudden bylaw changes targeting one specific person's project. Individually, each sounded like petty HOA drama. Together, they sounded like a pattern with a single architect behind it. Rick Hoyt's wife, oddly, was among those who quietly reached out, admitting her husband had grown uncomfortable with some board decisions but felt trapped. Financially indebted to Sandra through a business loan neither of them liked to discuss. Fear, turned out, had built Sandra's kingdom as much as charm had. I finished the wall's structural shell that weekend despite everything. The concrete finally cured to strength. Rebar locked into footings rated well beyond county minimums. Standing back to look at it, gray and blunt against the manicured lawns, I felt less shame than I expected. I felt, for the first time, safe. Sandra drove past slowly in her golf cart that evening, staring at the finished wall through oversized sunglasses. She didn't stop, didn't wave, didn't smile her usual smile. For just a moment, before she sped off, I thought I saw something closer to worry cross her face than contempt. The following week brought an unexpected letter. Not from the HOA, but from the county floodplain office, forwarding a citizen complaint filed against my property claiming unauthorized structural modification creating drainage hazard to neighboring lots. The complainant's name was redacted, but I didn't need it spelled out. An inspector, a calm older man named Walt Kessler, came out to review the complaint personally. He walked my wall's footings, checked my grading plans, compared everything against my original approved permit. "This is textbook," he told me, almost apologetically. "Whoever filed this doesn't understand hydrology. Or doesn't want to." Walt mentioned, almost as an aside, that he remembered approving drainage plans for this very development 20 years earlier, under a contractor named Harold Voss, and that the built culverts had never quite matched the submitted engineering. "We flagged it back then," he said. "Paperwork said it got corrected." I always wondered. That single sentence detonated quietly in my chest. The corrected paperwork Walt remembered signing off on had apparently existed only on paper, never in the actual undersized concrete pipes beneath Maple Bend Road, pipes that would someday need to carry far more water than they'd ever been built to hold. I asked Walt if county records from that era still existed. He said older permit files were archived at the regional office. Technically public record, though rarely requested. I drove there myself 2 days later, spending 4 hours in a windowless room paging through decades-old blueprints under fluorescent light. I found it eventually, a discrepancy buried in a stapled addendum. The as-built corrected drainage plan bore a county stamp dated a full year before the inspection that supposedly required the correction in the first place. An impossible sequence unless someone had backdated the paperwork after the fact. My hands actually shook holding the photocopy. This wasn't aesthetic disagreement anymore. Wasn't a dispute over paint colors or fence heights. This was documentary evidence that the neighborhood's core flood infrastructure had been falsified decades ago. By the woman's own late husband, and possibly covered for ever since. I brought copies to Priya immediately. She went quiet reading them, then said the words I'd been dreading and half hoping for at once. "Daniel, this isn't just an HOA dispute anymore. If this is what it looks like, you might be sitting on evidence of actual fraud." I asked her what that meant for the appeal hearing. She smiled. The first real smile I'd seen from her in weeks. "It means we stop playing defense," she said. "We stop asking permission to protect your own house. We start asking why nobody protected this entire street from a woman who's known for years." That night I couldn't tell Mara everything. Not yet. Not until I understood the full shape of it. But I told her enough. She sat very still at the table, then reached across and gripped my hand. "Your dad would be proud you didn't just build a wall," she said quietly. "You built proof." Denise, Sandra's former assistant, agreed to meet me at a diner 2 towns over, somewhere Sandra's reach couldn't touch. She brought a thumb drive she'd kept for insurance since her firing. Copies of financial ledgers she'd been told to shred but couldn't quite bring herself to destroy. The ledgers showed thousands of dollars. Over several years. Transferred from the HOA reserve account into a private LLC registered to Sandra's maiden name. an LLC that, according to public filings, owned exactly one property, the cash-purchased lake house 18 months prior. I asked Denise why she was risking this now, after staying quiet for 2 years. She looked out the diner window a long moment. Because my sister lives 3 houses down from you, she said. And because somebody needs to be able to sleep in this town when the water finally comes. Driving home that night, I understood for the first time that this had stopped being about my wall entirely. It had become about whether an entire community would drown, quite literally, under the weight of one woman's decade of small, unexamined cruelties and one very large, carefully hidden theft. For a strange, brief stretch, things almost went quiet. The county's continuance pushed my appeal hearing back 3 more weeks, and Sandra, perhaps sensing something shifting she couldn't name, eased off the daily fines and public shaming for a while, as if holding her breath. Walt Kessler quietly reviewed the archived files himself and confirmed, off the record, that my findings matched what he remembered flagging decades earlier. He couldn't act unilaterally, he explained, but encouraged me to file a formal complaint with the state's floodplain management division alongside my county appeal. I spent that calm week finishing the wall's final touches, a discrete drainage channel directing runoff safely toward the storm system instead of pooling against the foundation, exactly as my original submitted plans specified. For the first time in months, I slept without checking rainfall radar at 3 a.m. Lily helped me plant flowering vines along the wall's base one Saturday, her small hands pressing soil around each root ball with fierce concentration. "Now it's pretty and strong," she declared proudly, and I laughed harder than I had in weeks. Grateful for a child's uncomplicated wisdom, the Ferraros stopped by unannounced with a casserole, an apology, of sorts, for their earlier silence. "We should have spoken up months ago, Mrs. Ferraro admitted at our door. "We were scared of the fines. Watching you keep fighting made us ashamed of being scared." Mara hugged her without hesitation. Even Rick Hoyt's wife sent a brief, careful text. "For what it's worth, I hope you win." I didn't reply immediately, unsure yet who among the board could actually be trusted. But I saved the message, another small brick in a wall of a different kind I was quietly building. Priya filed the formal fraud complaint with the state floodplain division, attaching Walt's informal corroboration and the backdated permit discrepancy. Careful to keep Denise's identity protected for now under a confidential source designation the agency allowed for financial whistleblowers. A state investigator called within days. A brisk, no-nonsense woman named Agent Torres, who asked precise questions about dates, document sources, and chain of custody. She warned me these investigations moved slowly, sometimes months, sometimes longer, and that Sandra would likely learn nothing had formally begun yet. I asked Torres what would happen if a major storm hit before her investigation finished. Her answer was blunt. "Then the infrastructure fails exactly the way your documents predict it will, and people find out the hard way instead of the careful way. I'd rather it be the careful way." The weather that week stayed deceptively gentle. Blue skies, mild afternoons, the kind of spring beauty that lulls a floodplain into forgetting what it actually is. I watched the long-range forecast anyway, the way old sailors watch a barometer, trusting instinct built from years of respecting water's patience. Mr. did one evening, bringing a bottle of his homemade hot sauce as a peace offering neither of us needed. You did what I never had the courage to do at your age, he told me, settling into a lawn chair by my finished wall. Fight it properly, on paper, not just anger. He told me stories that night about the neighborhood's early years, about how Harold Voss used to boast at barbecues that he could build twice as fast for half the price. A boast the entire development had apparently celebrated instead of questioned, back when nobody imagined the bill would ever come due. I asked Delgado, gently, whether he thought Sandra had known from the start or discovered the drainage shortcuts only after inheriting the HOA's books. He considered it a long moment. "Does it matter?" he finally said.
She's had 11 years to fix it and spent.
That calm week ended with a single line in the Weather Service's extended outlook. Easy to miss if you weren't looking. An unusual low-pressure system stalling over the coast, feeding moisture inland for what forecasters called, almost casually, a potentially significant multi-day rainfall event the following week. I printed that forecast and pinned it to our refrigerator beside the county floodplain letter. 2 documents months apart finally speaking the same quiet, undeniable language. Mara looked at it a long time, then simply said, "Good thing we have a wall," and went back to making dinner. The forecast sharpened over the next few days. Models converging on a slow-moving storm system expected to stall directly over our watershed, dumping what meteorologists estimated could be 6 to 10 inches of rain across 72 hours. An amount our undersized culverts were never designed to move. I raised it at the next HOA meeting anyway. One final good faith attempt, presenting the forecast alongside Walt's informal review and asking the board to authorize emergency clearing of the Maple Bend culverts before the storm arrived. At minimum, as a stopgap measure. Sandra dismissed it in under a minute, calling the forecast media hysteria, and reminding the room that Willow Creek had never truly flooded in her tenure. A claim technically true only because her tenure had been carefully timed around the one flood that predated it. Rick Hoyt seconded her dismissal, but I noticed his eyes on the printed forecast longer than his words suggested. And his wife, seated in the back row this time instead of absent as usual, didn't clap when the motion to table the matter passed. Walking out, Denise texted me a photo she'd apparently kept from her old files. An invoice from a drainage contractor dated 2 years earlier for culvert clearing work at Maple Bend, marked paid in full from the HOA reserve account. Work that, standing in the actual street, had visibly never been done. I forwarded the invoice to Agent Torres immediately. She confirmed it matched no permit or inspection record on the county side, meaning either the contractor had taken payment without performing work, or, more likely given everything else, the invoice itself was fabricated to explain away missing reserve funds. Priya suggested we request an emergency county inspection citing imminent public safety risk, bypassing the HOA entirely since flood infrastructure fell under county, not HO, jurisdiction regardless of what Sandra's bylaws claimed. Walt agreed to expedite it, scheduling a site visit for 2 days out. Sandra apparently learned of the request within hours, HOA management offices being smaller gossip mills than anyone liked to admit. She called an emergency board session that same evening, framing my inspection request as an attack on community sovereignty and proposing a resolution to formally censure me. I attended anyway, standing quietly through 20 minutes of Sandra's increasingly personal accusations that I was obsessed, litigious, determined to destroy neighborhood harmony over one ugly wall. I said nothing until she finally paused for breath, then simply asked her to explain the 2-year-old ghost invoice. The room went silent in a way I'd never heard an HOA meeting go silent. Sandra's smile flickered, just once, a crack in porcelain. I have no idea what invoice you're referring to, she said. Too quickly, too sharply, and I watched 3 board members glance at each other instead of at her. Rick Hoyt cleared his throat and asked, almost gently, if the board could actually review the reserve fund's itemized statements before voting on any censure. Sandra's composure snapped for half a second. Since when do you question procedure, Richard? She snapped, and the room felt the temperature drop several degrees. The censure vote failed, 4-3. The first time in 11 years anyone present could remember Sandra losing a motion on the board floor. She adjourned the meeting abruptly, gathering her papers with hands that were, I noticed, no longer entirely steady. 2 days later, Walt's emergency inspection confirmed everything in writing. The Maple Bend culverts were undersized, partially obstructed with years of uncleared sediment, and structurally inadequate for the coming storm's projected volume. The county issued an emergency directive requiring immediate clearing at HOA expense. Sandra had no legal path left to ignore a direct county safety order, but she still tried, delaying contractor authorization for 2 more critical days, arguing over bidding procedures while the low-pressure system off the coast continued strengthening exactly as the forecasters had warned it would. I offered, at my own expense, to hire an emergency crew myself just to get the worst obstruction cleared. Unwilling to watch bureaucratic stalling cost us the only window of preparation we had left. Sandra, astonishingly, tried to block even that, citing unauthorized work on HOA-maintained infrastructure. Walt personally intervened this time, informing the HOA management company in writing that further obstruction of emergency flood mitigation could constitute actionable negligence under state floodplain law, a phrase that finally, grudgingly, got contractor trucks moving toward Maple Bend Road 2 days before the rain began. The crew found what I already suspected: culverts choked with decades of silt, roots, and debris, functioning at a fraction of even their undersized original capacity. The foreman shook his head at me. Another week out and this would have backed up your whole street on a normal thunderstorm, let alone a real system. Sandra's daughter, a college student named Emily I'd only met briefly before, showed up at my door unannounced that evening, nervous, glancing over her shoulder like she wasn't sure she should be there at all. I need to tell you something about my mom, she said quietly. About the lake house. Emily explained she'd overheard her mother on the phone months earlier, arguing with someone about moving the rest before anyone starts asking real questions, and had assumed at the time it was ordinary financial talk. After hearing rumors about my investigation, she'd started putting pieces together herself, unable to stay silent. She handed me a printed bank statement she'd found in her mother's home office, showing a transfer from the HOA management account into Sandra's private LLC dated just 3 days after my initial records request, an apparent attempt to obscure the fund's true balance before I could see it. I asked Emily why she'd bring this to me instead of confronting her mother directly. She looked down at her hands a long moment. Because she'll just explain it away to my face like she always does, she said. But numbers don't lie the way she does. I want someone who'll actually use them. I forwarded everything to Torres and Priya that same night. My hands steady now in a way they hadn't been weeks earlier, Not from calm but from clarity. This wasn't rage anymore. This was evidence. Assembled the way you assemble a structural failure report, fact by fact. Load by load. The rain started 2 nights later. Gentle at first. The kind that made the neighborhood smell like wet cedar and cut grass. Deceptively pleasant. The calm opening note of a storm system meteorologists were now calling. Without hedging. One of the most significant rainfall events the region had seen in decades. I checked my wall's footings and drainage channel obsessively that first night. Flashlight in hand. Rain jacket zipped to my chin. Tracing every seam for weakness the way I'd trace stress fractures on a bridge inspection. Mara brought me coffee at midnight and simply stood beside me in the dark, watching the water rise. By the second morning, the Sabine Fork had climbed visibly against its banks, brown and swollen, moving with a low, constant roar that carried across the whole neighborhood even with windows shut. County emergency alerts began pinging phones, advising residents in low-lying areas to prepare for possible evacuation. Sandra sent her own neighborhood email that morning. Remarkably, still insisting the situation was under control, and that panic helps no one, even as county trucks rolled slowly down Maple Bend Road placing sandbags around the very culverts her board had refused to clear for weeks. I spent that day helping the Ferraros and 2 other families sandbag their lower windows, sharing what I knew about flood behavior, elevation, and safe evacuation routes. Information I'd gathered obsessively over years, never imagining I'd finally need to hand it out door to door like emergency flyers. Rick Hoyt, of all people, showed up to help too, quiet and grim-faced, hauling sandbags without a word about board politics. At one point he paused beside me and said, low enough that only I could hear, I should have listened to you months ago. I'm sorry it took this. By that evening, the rain had intensified into a relentless, drumming downpour, the kind that made conversation on a porch require raised voices. The river gauge upstream, which I now checked every 20 minutes on my phone, had crossed minor flood stage and was climbing toward moderate faster than any forecast predicted. Mara and I moved Lily's most precious belongings to the second floor that night. Not from panic but from the calm. Practice caution I'd learned from a childhood spent watching my father never quite finish that same task in time. This time, I told myself, we would finish it early. Emily texted again close to midnight, this time frightened rather than defiant. My mom just got a call from someone at the bank, she wrote. She's been on the phone for an hour, yelling. I think she knows something's coming besides the storm. I didn't respond. I simply kept watching the gauge climb. Agent Torres called me directly the next morning, her voice tight with the particular urgency of someone racing a clock she couldn't control. We've secured enough documentation to move forward, she said. But your county's flood timeline just accelerated ours. I need you to keep everything exactly as it is. Don't confront her yet. I promised her I wouldn't. Though watching Sandra's continued public denials on the neighborhood forum, insisting Willow Creek's infrastructure was perfectly sound, even as the river climbed toward the culverts her husband had built decades ago, tested every ounce of restraint I had left in me. By that second full day of rain, the Sabine Fork had reached major flood stage upstream, and County Emergency Management issued a mandatory evacuation order for all properties within the expanded floodplain. The very properties Sandra had spent months insisting weren't actually at risk in the first place. Half the neighborhood scrambled that afternoon, packing cars, arguing over what could fit, discovering too late how little time proper evacuation actually takes when you've spent months believing the danger was exaggerated by media hysteria instead of documented. In writing, months in advance, Sandra, remarkably, held one final HOA notice meeting that afternoon in the clubhouse, insisting residents not overreact and that leaving valuables behind was unnecessary. Fewer than a dozen people attended. Most, I later learned, were already loading their cars in driveways instead of listening to her one last time. I stayed behind with Mara and Lily, choosing, after careful calculation with waltz numbers and my own engineering models, to shelter in place on our second floor rather than risk driving through what were already becoming impassable low-water crossings on every road leading out of Willow Creek. My wall held its first real test that evening as water crept up the swale toward our property line, curling against the concrete and finding nowhere to go but around, exactly as designed, diverting the flow safely toward the storm drain rather than pooling against our foundation the way it once might have. Across the street, the Whitakers' home, the same neighbors who'd worried about my wall's curb appeal months earlier, began taking water through their garage by nightfall, their lower-lying lot offering no such protection, their panicked voices carrying across the rain-soaked street as they scrambled to save what they could. I waded across, waist-deep by the time I reached them, helping move boxes and photo albums to their attic space, saying nothing about the wall, about the meetings, about any of it. There was no room left that night for being right. There was only room for helping. By midnight, the storm drain system throughout the lower half of the neighborhood began backing up exactly as the emergency inspection had warned it might. Sediment-choked culverts finally overwhelmed entirely, sending muddy water sheeting across yards and pooling against foundations never built with any real margin for error. Rick Hoyt called me from his truck, stranded halfway down a flooded street trying to reach his elderly mother-in-law's house, asking, voice cracking, whether I thought the water would keep rising. I told him the truth, that the gauge showed no sign of cresting yet, and to get to higher ground immediately. Emily called next, sobbing, saying her mother had refused to evacuate the house, insisting the water wouldn't dare reach the lake house standard she'd built her reputation on. Still, even now, more concerned with appearances than with the 6 inches of water already crossing her own threshold. I told Emily to get herself somewhere safe regardless of what her mother chose to do, and that I would try to help however I could once conditions allowed. She thanked me through tears, the daughter of the woman who'd fined me thousands of dollars, now trusting me more than her own mother's judgment. Around 1 in the morning, the power grid across the lower neighborhood failed entirely, plunging Willow Creek into a darkness broken only by phone flashlights, distant emergency vehicle strobes, and the constant, ominous roar of water finding every low place it had ever been denied. I stood at my second-floor window watching the flood spread across yards I'd walked 100 times, transforming familiar geometry into something unrecognizable. The community pool Sandra loved to brag about now simply an indistinguishable patch of the same brown, moving water covering everything else. Mara held Lily close on the bed behind me, our daughter finally asleep despite the chaos, exhausted past fear. I stayed at that window most of the night, tracking the water line against my wall's markers, watching it hold, watching the diverted flow carve safely around us instead of through us. By dawn, the rain finally began to ease, though the river, fed by everything upstream still draining through the watershed, continued climbing for hours. After the sky cleared, a delayed cruelty nobody who hadn't studied hydrology would have anticipated in the sudden false relief of blue sky overhead. I ventured out at first light in waders, camera in hand, documenting the damage with the same careful instinct that had documented everything else these past months. Nearly every home on the low side of Maple Bend Road showed water lines 2 to 3 feet up their exterior walls. My own house stood dry inside, the wall having done exactly what 4 feet of engineered concrete was designed to do, diverting the flow around our foundation and into the storm system instead of through our living room, sparing us the fate that had claimed my father 24 years earlier. Sandra's own house, I discovered walking further down the block toward the river, sat among the worst hit on the entire street, water lines nearly to the windowsills, her prized landscaping reduced to mud and debris, her ornate entrance fountain buried under a fallen tree limb and silt. Neighbors gathered slowly in the gray morning light, exhausted, stunned, comparing damage in the particular shell-shocked murmur of people who'd survived something together. More than one glanced toward my dry, standing wall, then toward their own ruined homes, the calculation on their faces unmistakable, even unspoken. Mr. Me first among the gathering crowd, gripping my shoulder hard. "You did it," he said simply, voice rough. "Everyone thought you were crazy for that wall. Look at your house." I didn't feel triumphant. I felt only exhausted and sad. Word moved through the neighborhood fast that morning, the way it always does after disaster, that Sandra's house had flooded worse than almost anyone's, and that Emily had been seen helping her mother wade out through waist-deep water sometime before dawn. Both of them soaked, silent, and shaken. By mid-morning, with the water still slowly receding but far from gone, county emergency crews moved through Willow Creek by boat, checking on stranded residents, and assessing structural damage house by house, their radios crackling with addresses that read, increasingly, like a roll call of Sandra's staunchest supporters. I learned later that Sandra, rather than accepting evacuation help when the water first breached her home, had spent nearly 2 precious hours trying to move boxes from her home office to higher ground. Boxes Emily would later confirm contained physical financial records she'd never fully digitized. Agent Torres called me that afternoon, her voice carrying an edge I hadn't heard before, urgency layered over something almost like anger. "We have a problem," she said. "Sandra Voss appears to be trying to relocate physical evidence before we can execute a formal records request. I need you to stay reachable." I asked what that meant for the investigation's timeline. Torres explained that the flood, ironically, had both endangered and accelerated everything, forcing her office to move faster than planned before crucial paper records, damaged by rising water, became unreadable or, worse, conveniently lost in the chaos of disaster cleanup. That evening, still without power, I watched from my dry porch as a moving truck, absurdly, tried and failed to navigate the still flooded end of Sandra Street, forced to turn back by county barricades, its driver arguing loudly with an officer about emergency property retrieval that looked, to anyone watching, like something else entirely. Denise called me that night, breathless. "She's panicking," she said. "I still have friends who talk to people close to her. She's trying to get access to a storage unit 2 counties over, the one under her mother's maiden name. That's where the rest of it is. Daniel. I'm sure of. I relayed everything immediately to Torres, who thanked me tersely and hung up fast, clearly already moving. I sat afterward at my kitchen table in the flashlight-lit dark, struck by how strange it felt that the woman who'd fought so hard to hide the truth was now, herself, drowning in the consequences of it. The next day brought a different kind of flood. Reporters. A local news van parked at the neighborhood entrance, drawn by scanner chatter about irregular financial activity tied to flood damage in an HOA community. The kind of story that practically wrote its own dramatic headline before anyone even confirmed the details. I declined an on-camera interview, unwilling to speak publicly before Torres's investigation concluded properly. But I noticed Sandra, muddy and disheveled, attempting the opposite, approaching the reporter herself, composing her face into something like her old practiced calm, even standing in front of her own ruined fountain. This flood was simply an unprecedented natural disaster, she told the camera, voice steady despite everything. No community could have fully prepared for something this extreme. I watched the clip later that night, struck by her genuine talent for sounding reasonable while saying something she now knew, better than anyone, to be false. Rick Hoyt, watching the same broadcast at my kitchen table where he'd come to help move waterlogged furniture out of the Whitaker's garage, shook his head slowly. She really believes she can talk her way out of anything, he muttered. She's done it for 11 years. Why would this time feel different to her? I told him it would feel different this time because, for the first time, the paper trail existed independent of her control. Documents Denise had preserved, statements Emily had provided, invoices Torres had already subpoenaed from 3 separate banks before Sandra even realized how far the investigation had already reached. That evening, county crews finally restored power to the upper half of the neighborhood, though the lower streets, including Sandra's, remained dark, waterlogged, and largely uninhabitable, their residents scattered temporarily among relatives, hotels, and, in a handful of cases, generous neighbors whose homes had somehow survived intact. I opened my own home to the Ferraros for 3 days while their house dried out, an offer that felt strange given how coldly they'd once treated my wall. But Mara reminded me quietly that grace mattered more right now than keeping score, and I found, surprisingly, that I agreed with her completely. Sandra, notably, received no such offers from anyone on the board she'd led for over a decade. She and Emily checked into a highway motel 2 exits away, a detail Emily mentioned to me almost apologetically during a brief call, as if embarrassed on her mother's behalf for the absence of community goodwill. Torres called again 3 days after the flood, this time with news that shifted everything. The storage unit Denise had flagged had been located and, with a properly executed warrant, opened, revealing boxes of original financial ledgers dating back nearly a decade, alongside physical copies of the falsified drainage correction paperwork. Among those records, Torres explained carefully, was direct correspondence between Sandra and the original drainage contractor discussing how to resolve the discrepancy on paper after Walt's initial flag decades earlier, proof that Sandra hadn't merely inherited Harold's shortcuts unknowingly but had actively helped conceal them for years. I asked Torres the question that had been sitting heaviest in my chest since Delgado's first warning. Had Sandra known, specifically, that the culverts remained, dangerously undersized this entire time. Every year she'd blocked drainage improvements. Every year she'd diverted reserve funds toward cosmetic projects instead. Torres's answer was measured but unambiguous. The correspondence makes clear she understood the actual risk at least as far back as 8 years ago, she said. Everything since then, every fine against you specifically, every block study, appears designed to prevent exactly the kind of scrutiny that eventually exposed her. That knowledge sat differently than I expected. Not triumphant, not even fully angry anymore, just a heavy, aching clarity, the same feeling I imagined structural engineers must feel identifying. After the fact, the exact preventable crack that brought an entire bridge down years after someone first chose to ignore it. Sandra requested a meeting with me directly 2 days later. Arranged through Emily, held cautiously in a public diner parking lot rather than anywhere private. She looked smaller than I remembered, without her usual makeup, without her golf cart, without the practiced authority that had once filled every HOA meeting room. I know what you must think of me, she began, before I could say anything. But everything I did to protect this community's stability. People needed to believe their homes were safe and valuable. Panic would have destroyed us faster than any flood ever could. I let her finish before responding. You didn't protect anyone, I said quietly. You protected a fountain and a lake house while my daughter slept 11 feet from a swale you knew could flood. People trusted you with their safety, and you spent that trust on yourself. For years, while calling anyone who noticed the problem. She had no answer. She tried a different angle then, softer, almost pleading. The board fines against you. I could arrange to have those dropped entirely, quietly. No admission of anything, she offered. This doesn't have to go further than it already has. I recognized the offer instantly, the same one Rick Hoyt had made months earlier. I told her the fines were the least of what was already in motion, that Torres's investigation existed independent of anything I could withdraw even if I wanted to, which I didn't. Sandra's composure finally cracked fully then. Tears she clearly hated shedding running down a face stripped of its usual armor. I never meant for it to become this, she said, voice breaking. It started small, a little cushion here, a little there, and then it was easier to keep hiding it than to ever admit how far it had gone. I believed, in that moment, that this particular sentence, at least, was true. I told her that didn't change what it had cost other people. That intent didn't rebuild the Whitakers' flooded garage or refund the Ferraros' insurance premiums or return the years other homeowners had spent believing they were simply imagining problems that Sandra had known, in writing, to be entirely real. She asked, quietly, almost childlike, what would happen to her now? I told her honestly that I didn't know, that it wasn't my decision anymore, that it belonged to Torres, to prosecutors, to a process finally moving forward on evidence instead of on whichever version of events Sandra found most convenient that week. Driving home from that parking lot, I felt none of the vindication I might have imagined feeling months earlier, watching my wall get vandalized, watching fines pile up, watching my daughter cry over a schoolyard insult repeated from adult mouths. I felt only tired, and relieved, and strangely sad for Emily most of all. Emily called me that night, thanking me for meeting her mother despite everything, for treating her with more grace than the situation strictly required. "I know what she did was wrong," she said carefully. "But she's still my mom. I don't know how to hold both those things at once yet." I told her she didn't need to figure that out tonight. That grief and anger toward the same person could coexist for a long time without resolution. That I understood something about complicated inheritance myself. Having spent 24 years both loving and resenting my father's stubborn refusal to believe his levy could fail. The following week, prosecutors formally charged Sandra with multiple counts of embezzlement, financial fraud, and falsification of public safety records, charges that carried, according to Priya, a realistic possibility of significant prison time given the scale and duration of the documented misconduct across nearly a decade. The HOA board, meanwhile, dissolved itself in an emergency vote, replaced temporarily by a court-appointed receiver tasked with managing the community's finances and infrastructure repairs until residents could properly reorganize under new, more transparent governance, a process Priya volunteered, unprompted, to help oversee pro bono. Rick Hoyt resigned publicly from what remained of the board, admitting in a written statement to the neighborhood that he'd suspected irregularities for years but lacked the courage to challenge Sandra directly, an admission that earned him more respect from neighbors, oddly, than his years of silent compliance ever had. I was asked, somewhat to my own surprise, to help the receiver's engineering consultant develop a proper drainage remediation plan for Maple Bend Road. My earlier calculations and county documentation suddenly transformed from a personal defense exhibit into the neighborhood's actual roadmap toward genuine safety. Walt Kessler retired from the county that autumn but stayed on as an informal advisor to the remediation project, telling me over coffee one afternoon that watching the truth finally surface, 20 years after he'd first flagged Harold Voss's shortcuts, felt like closing a file he'd never quite been able to stop thinking about. The Whitakers rebuilt their garage that fall and, unprompted, asked my advice on elevation grading for their new construction, a request that would have been unthinkable 8 months earlier when they'd worried more about my wall's curb appeal than their own home's actual vulnerability to the river beside it. Mrs. organized a neighborhood potluck at the clubhouse once repairs allowed, inviting every household, including, pointedly, my family, seated at the center table rather than the edges where gossip and suspicion had once quietly placed us throughout the long, exhausting months of the dispute. Delgado gave a short, unplanned toast that evening, raising a can of soda since the clubhouse still hadn't restocked its refrigerator properly. "To the man who built an ugly wall," he said, grinning, and turned out to have the prettiest foresight on this whole street. The room laughed, warmly, for the first time in months. Emily visited occasionally that fall, navigating her mother's ongoing legal proceedings with a steadiness that impressed me, choosing to finish her semester locally rather than transfer away, telling me once that staying close felt like the only way to prove to herself she wasn't simply repeating her mother's instinct to run from consequences. Sandra's case moved slowly through the court system as such cases do, plea negotiations dragging across winter. The lake house eventually seized and liquidated as part of restitution proceedings meant to partially reimburse the HOA reserve fund and, by extension, every family whose dues had quietly funded her decade of concealment. I testified once, during a pretrial hearing, laying out my original engineering documentation the same calm, methodical way I'd once presented it to an HOA board that hadn't wanted to hear it. This time, a room full of people actually listened, actually understood, actually let the numbers speak for themselves. Sandra didn't look at me during that hearing, staring instead at some fixed point on the courtroom's back wall. Though Emily, seated a few rows behind her mother, caught my eye briefly and offered a small, tired nod that felt like the closest thing to closure either of us was likely to get that day. By late winter, the new drainage infrastructure was finally under construction. Properly sized culverts replacing Harold Voss's decades-old shortcuts, funded partly by county emergency grants and partly by restitution funds slowly working their way back into an HOA account now managed with itemized, publicly posted transparency for the first time in its history. My wall still stood through it all, weathered now, softened by the flowering vines Lily had planted. No longer an eyesore in anyone's eyes but simply, quietly, a fixture of the street. The thing neighbors pointed to when explaining to newcomers why Willow Creek finally took its floodplain status seriously. Spring arrived again almost exactly a year after that first cease and desist notice had appeared taped to my door. And with it came the anxious, watchful energy of an entire neighborhood that had learned, the hard way, to actually read county rainfall forecasts instead of dismissing them as bureaucratic exaggeration. The new HOA board, elected properly that January under bylaws PRIA, had helped rewrite for genuine transparency, invited me to present the completed drainage remediation results at their very first spring meeting. A strange, quiet full-circle moment standing at the same podium Sandra once used to mock my wall. I kept the presentation simple. Numbers and photographs. Before and after culvert diameters. Projected flow capacities under various storm scenarios. Careful to frame it not as vindication but as information. The exact thing I tried to offer 18 months earlier when nobody in that room had wanted to hear it. Rick Hoyt, now serving as an ordinary homeowner rather than a board member, asked thoughtful questions from the audience, the kind he might have asked years earlier. If fear and financial entanglement hadn't kept him quiet through Sandra's entire tenure. Questions that showed genuine, hard-won understanding rather than performance. Mr. Elected board president himself now closed the meeting by proposing an annual flood preparedness review every March, timed deliberately to precede storm season. A motion that passed unanimously without a single dissenting vote. Something unimaginable in the old HOA's rigid, image-obsessed culture. That same week, another slow-moving low-pressure system began forming off the coast. Smaller than the previous year's storm but still significant enough to trigger renewed county flood advisories. Testing, almost immediately, whether the neighborhood's hard-earned lessons and expensive repairs would actually hold under real pressure. This time, nobody dismissed the forecast as media hysteria. Families began sandbagging preemptively. The new culverts got a priority inspection 2 days before the rain arrived. And the community's emergency phone tree, another new addition, buzzed with practical coordination instead of gossip and denial. I checked the river gauge that week from habit more than anxiety. The particular fear that had once lived permanently in my chest now settled into something closer. To careful vigilance. The difference, I realized, between living beside danger you've hidden from and living beside danger you've finally, honestly prepared for. The rain came, steady and serious for 2 days, and the new drainage system, properly sized at last. Moved water through Maple Bend Road exactly the way Walt's original blueprints had specified decades earlier. Before Harold Voss's shortcuts. Before Sandra's silence. Before any of it had ever needed to become a crisis at all. The river climbed toward moderate flood stage but never breached it. The swollen water moving efficiently through channels finally capable of carrying what nature actually demanded of them. And by the storm's third morning, Willow Creek stood damp, tired, but entirely, remarkably, intact from end to end. Neighbors gathered on dry porches that final morning instead of wading through flooded streets, comparing notes on how well the new system had performed, several admitting openly, without shame this time, how frightened they'd been the year before and how differently prepared they felt watching this storm pass through safely. Emily texted me a single line that afternoon. Watched the forecast all week. Almost couldn't believe it when nothing happened this time. Thank you for not letting this town forget what almost happened to it. I read it twice, then showed it to Mara, who simply smiled and said, "She's going to be all right, Sandra." I later learned through Priya, accepted a plea agreement that spring, avoiding a lengthy trial in exchange for a sentence that included several years of incarceration alongside substantial financial restitution, a resolution neither triumphant nor particularly satisfying, simply the slow, unglamorous machinery of consequence finally completing its work. I didn't attend her sentencing, choosing instead to spend that particular afternoon helping Lily build an actual, deliberately silly sandcastle wall at the county park by the river, teaching her, half joking, about proper footings and drainage channels, watching her giggle at the idea that even pretend walls needed real engineering. Mara asked me that evening whether I felt satisfied. Finally, watching the whole saga reach something like an ending. I thought about it a long time before answering. Satisfied isn't quite it, I said.
I feel like a bridge that finally got properly installed.
The wall itself became something of a quiet local landmark that second spring. Newcomers to the neighborhood occasionally stopping to ask about the flowering vines and the unusually thoughtful drainage channel running discreetly along its base, never guessing at the year of fines, threats, and vandalism buried beneath its calm, established look. I told the story sometimes, when asked, careful to keep it factual rather than bitter, framing it less as a tale of one villain and more as a lesson about what happens when a community lets appearance matter more than substance for too many quiet, comfortable years in a row. Delgado, now well into his role as board president, made a habit of ending every March preparedness meeting with the same closing line, half joke and half genuine tribute. Remember, folks, sometimes the ugliest thing in the neighborhood is the only thing standing between you and the bottom of the river. Rick Hoyt eventually paid off the business debt that had once bound him so tightly to Sandra's silence, and the following year he built his own modest, retaining improvements along his property's low corner, quietly, without fanfare, simply doing the sensible thing he'd once been too afraid to do out loud. The Whitakers sent us a Christmas card that winter with a photo of their rebuilt garage. Elevated now, properly graded, a small handwritten note inside reading simply, "Thank you for the wall we used to make fun of. We should have listened sooner. Glad you never stopped building it anyway." Lily, older now, sometimes told her own version of the story to visiting cousins, dramatically embellished with details that grew a little each telling. her father's flood wall transforming in her telling from 4 feet of engineered concrete into something closer to a castle rampart that had single-handedly saved the entire kingdom. I let her tell it however she wanted, understanding that every family needs its own mythology, its own way of explaining why the strange, stubborn, unpopular choice their father made one difficult year turned out, eventually, to matter far more than anyone standing on the sidewalk that first morning could have guessed. Mara and I sometimes sat on that same porch in the evenings, watching the river move calmly past in its ordinary, unremarkable way, grateful for how boring, how thoroughly uneventful, the water now seemed most days, a hard-won kind of peace neither of us took entirely for granted anymore. Emily graduated that spring and, surprisingly, chose to pursue a degree in public policy focused on housing and infrastructure oversight, telling me once over coffee that watching her mother's downfall up close had taught her, painfully but permanently, how much damage unchecked authority could quietly do when nobody was allowed to question it. I attended one of her early presentations, years later, on transparency reforms for homeowners associations, watching a young woman stand at a podium calmly explaining exactly the kind of systemic accountability her own mother had spent a decade avoiding, a full, unlikely circle closing itself in a direction none of us could have predicted. The county eventually used Willow Creek's story, anonymized somewhat but recognizable to anyone who'd lived through it, as a case study in mandatory HOA financial transparency legislation that passed the following legislative session, requiring public itemized reserve fund statements for every homeowners association across the state. Walt Kessler, fully retired now, told me once at a community barbecue that knowing his old flagged concern from 20 years earlier had eventually led somewhere, however painfully, gave him more peace about his own long career than almost anything else he'd worked on. A quiet closing of a very old, very stubborn loop. I still work as a structural engineer. Still design bridges meant to hold weight nobody hopes will ever actually test them. But I find myself, now, paying closer attention than ever to the quiet, unglamorous infrastructure beneath ordinary daily life, the culverts and drainage channels nobody notices until the day they desperately need them. Sandra wrote me one letter from her incarceration, nearly a year into her sentence. An oddly formal apology that acknowledged the harm done but still, faintly, carried the same instinct toward self-justification I remembered from that parking lot conversation. Protecting the community's stability, preserving property values, always some larger noble reason attached. I didn't respond to the letter, not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely no longer needed anything from her. Not an apology, not an explanation, not even the satisfaction of a final confrontation. The water had already answered every question that mattered, in the plainest, most undeniable language it knew. The wall stood through 3 more storm seasons after that, each one smaller than the flood that first proved its worth, each one a little less frightening than the last, until eventually it simply became, as ordinary infrastructure eventually always does, something people forgot to even notice was there at all. That, I came to understand, was its own quiet form of victory. Not applause, not vindication, not even gratitude, but the simple, unremarkable fact of a family sleeping soundly through a rainstorm that, in another version of this story, might have taken everything from them the way it once took everything from me. On the anniversary of that first flood, we hosted a small gathering ourselves this time. Neighbors old and new gathered around the flowering vines climbing my once mocked concrete wall, the same wall that had briefly made me the most unpopular man on the street and, eventually, the reason the entire street still stood. 2 years to the week after the flood that changed everything, a new storm system began building far out over the Gulf, larger and slower than anything the region had faced since, drawing the kind of grim, watchful attention from meteorologists that made even seasoned residents check their supplies without needing to be told twice. This storm carried a name this time, strong enough to earn one, and the county issued advisories nearly a full week in advance. Advisories that Willow Creek, for the first time in its history, actually heeded immediately and completely, without a single dismissive newsletter insisting panic helped no one. I watched the forecast track shift over several days with the particular calm dread of someone who understood exactly what worst-case numbers meant. The storm's projected rainfall totals eventually exceeding even the flood that had once nearly taken this entire neighborhood down to its foundations. The new HOA board, led capably by Delgado, activated the community's emergency plan immediately, staged sandbags at every low-lying property, confirmed the rebuilt culvert's clearance status with the county, and coordinated a voluntary early evacuation for anyone uncomfortable riding out a storm of this projected magnitude. Mara and I discussed, seriously this time, whether to evacuate with Lily rather than shelter in place again. Weighing my wall's proven track record against a storm system meteorologists kept calling, with unusual bluntness, potentially historic for the region, language that made even my engineer's confidence waver slightly. We ultimately decided to send Mara and Lily to her sister's house 2 hours inland, out of caution rather than doubt in the wall itself, while I stayed behind, to monitor the property, coordinate with neighbors, and assist the emergency crews the way my engineering background had proven useful during the last crisis. The rain began 3 days later almost exactly as forecast, heavier and faster than the previous storm from the first hour, hammering rooftops with an intensity that made conversation on any porch immediately impossible. The neighborhood settling into the tense, practiced rhythm of people who now knew exactly what was coming. Emily called that first night, back from college for the summer, staying with a friend on higher ground across town, checking in nervously despite the distance between us now, still carrying, I think, some residual instinct to make sure the neighborhood her family had once endangered stayed safe this time around. By the second morning, the Sabine Fork had already reached the flood stage that had devastated Willow Creek 2 years earlier, climbing with an unnerving speed that suggested this storm might genuinely exceed its predecessor. The rebuilt culverts working at full capacity but facing a volume of water unlike anything on record. I checked my wall's footings obsessively again. The same ritual from 2 years earlier. Flashlight and rain jacket, tracing every seam, though this time the fear felt different, tempered by proven design rather than untested hope. A quiet confidence that didn't erase worry but did, at least, make room for it to sit beside competence. Rick Hoyt arrived at my door that afternoon in full rain gear, asking if I needed help monitoring drainage levels along the street. The same man who'd once seconded a motion to fine me weekly now standing soaked on my porch. Genuinely useful, genuinely present, a transformation neither of us needed to comment on aloud. Together we walked the length of Maple Bend Road, checking each rebuilt culvert's flow rate, radioing updates to Delgado at the clubhouse command post the new board had established. The same clubhouse where Sandra once projected humiliating photos of my half-built wall onto the wall for a laughing crowd. By nightfall, the river had crested moderate flood stage and kept climbing, water beginning to test the very edges of the new infrastructure's designed capacity. The storm's rainfall totals now officially exceeding the historic event from 2 years earlier by a significant, alarming margin no one had fully prepared for. The Whitakers' rebuilt, properly elevated garage held this time, water pooling harmlessly at its new, higher threshold instead of pouring inside the way it once had. A small, quiet victory, Mr. Whitaker texted me a photo of at midnight, simply captioned, "Grading matters. Thank you, Daniel." Around 2 in the morning, a section of the newly rebuilt culvert system near the old bottleneck point began showing signs of strain under record volume. Sediment and storm debris accumulating faster than the design's margin had anticipated, forcing an emergency crew, myself included, out into the storm to manually clear the blockage. We worked for nearly 3 hours in driving rain and rising water, hauling debris by hand and flashlight, the kind of physical, desperate labor that no amount of engineering calculation can fully substitute for when nature decides to test every margin you've built into a system on paper. By dawn, exhausted and soaked through, we'd cleared the blockage enough to restore full flow capacity, watching with something close to relief as the backed-up water along that stretch of road finally began receding instead of continuing its slow, threatening climb toward another round of flooded homes. The storm itself finally began weakening that same morning, its slow crawl inland finally losing the moisture feed that had sustained it for days, the rain tapering from relentless downpour to steady drizzle and, eventually, by early afternoon, to nothing at all, leaving only gray skies and exhausted relief in its wake. The river, true to its delayed pattern, continued climbing for hours after the rain itself stopped, cresting just before sunset at a level that officially exceeded the flood 2 years earlier. Yet this time, remarkably, no home in Willow Creek took on more than minor, manageable water damage. I stood on my porch that evening watching the water finally begin its slow retreat, my wall dry and holding exactly as designed, the neighborhood around it, battered but fundamentally intact. A stark, undeniable contrast to the devastation photographs I still kept from that first terrible morning 2 years earlier. Delgado called an impromptu gathering at the clubhouse the next afternoon, once conditions allowed, thanking everyone who'd worked through the night on the culvert crisis, singling out Rick Hoyt and myself specifically for the emergency clearing effort that had likely spared the lower street from serious flooding. Rick, uncharacteristically emotional, stood and spoke briefly to the gathered neighbors. 2 years ago, I helped fine a man for trying to save his own house, he said, voice unsteady. Last night he helped save half the street instead of holding a grudge. That's the kind of neighbor I want to be from now on. I felt no need to say much in response, standing quietly beside Mara, who'd driven back the moment roads cleared, Lily asleep against her shoulder, exhausted from the drive and the worry, both of them finally home to a house that had, once again, simply done exactly what it was built to do. Emily visited that weekend once travel was possible again, walking the repaired culvert line with me, asking careful, genuinely curious engineering questions, telling me she'd decided, after this second storm, to focus her eventual career specifically on floodplain infrastructure policy rather than housing generally, wanting to build the kind of expertise nobody in her family ever had. News coverage of the storm, this time, told a different story than 2 years earlier, focusing not on scandal or fraud but on resilient infrastructure and community preparedness. Willow Creek mentioned briefly as an example of a neighborhood that had, after painful lessons, actually rebuilt itself correctly instead of merely cosmetically. I gave one brief interview this time, careful and measured, crediting the county's rebuilt drainage system, the new board's transparency, and the neighborhood's collective willingness to finally take flood risks seriously, deliberately avoiding any mention of Sandra by name, unwilling to let her story overshadow the community's genuine, hard-won recovery. That evening, reviewing the storm's data with Walt over the phone, comparing rainfall totals and river crest levels against the rebuilt system's actual performance, he told me quietly that this second storm had been, in his professional opinion, the true test, the first storm having exposed the danger, this one having proven the fix. I thought about my father often in those days following the second storm, wondering what he might have made of it all. The wall, the investigation, the slow unraveling of a decade of hidden neglect, the strange, circuitous path that had led from his own preventable death to this neighborhood's hard one. Genuine safety. Mara found me one evening sitting quietly by the wall's base among lilies, now fully grown flowering vines, and asked what I was thinking about. That some walls take longer to finish than concrete and rebar, I told her. Some of them take years, and a flood, and a woman finally telling the truth. The county, in the months following the second storm, used Willow Creek's rebuilt drainage system as a model case for 2 neighboring developments facing similar floodplain reclassifications, sending engineers to study exactly the specifications Walt and I had spent so long fighting to have taken seriously in the first place. Priya, still handling occasional HOA transparency consultations for the new board, told me once over coffee that Willow Creek's bylaws had become something of a template, circulated among other reform-minded communities statewide, a strange, unplanned legacy for a fight that had started over nothing more than a rejected wall permit. Rick Hoyt eventually ran for, and won, a seat on the new board himself the following election cycle, campaigning openly on the platform of never again letting fear of one person's authority override a neighborhood's basic safety. An ironic, hard-earned redemption arc nobody, including Rick himself, could have predicted 2 years earlier. I declined repeated suggestions from neighbors that I run for the board too. Content instead to serve occasionally as a technical advisor on infrastructure matters, preferring to keep some distance from the politics that had once nearly cost me everything, satisfied simply knowing the systems themselves now actually worked as intended. Emily graduated the following spring, inviting my family to her ceremony, an invitation that surprised me until she explained, simply, that watching my persistence during the worst of her mother's downfall had taught her more about integrity than almost anything else in her entire education up to that point. Sandra remained incarcerated throughout this period, her case occasionally referenced in local coverage of the state's new HOA transparency laws as the incident that had prompted the legislation, her name gradually transforming, in public memory, From neighborhood authority figure to cautionary footnote in someone else's larger story of reform. I received, unexpectedly, a letter from the State Floodplain Management Division that spring, informally acknowledging that my original documentation and persistent advocacy had directly contributed to policy changes now affecting HOA-governed floodplain communities statewide. Quiet, bureaucratic thank you that meant more to me than any public recognition could have. Standing at my kitchen window one ordinary morning, watching Lily and two neighborhood kids play tag along the base of my once mocked wall, its concrete now barely visible beneath thick, established vines, I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't fully realized had still been unsettled until that exact moment. The final piece of the story arrived unexpectedly nearly 3 years after the original flood. When Torres called to inform me that Sandra, midway through her sentence, had requested a supervised meeting with community representatives as part of a restorative justice program the state occasionally offered for financial crime cases. I wasn't obligated to attend, Torres explained carefully, and no one would think less of me for declining. But the program existed specifically for victims and affected parties who wanted, or needed, some form of direct closure beyond what a courtroom verdict alone could ever really provide. I discussed it with Mara for several nights before deciding, ultimately, that I wanted to go, not for Sandra's sake, but for my own. Understanding by then that closure sometimes required deliberately walking back into a room you'd otherwise have every reason to avoid for the rest of your life. The meeting took place in a modest facility conference room. Sandra seated across a plain table, older looking than her photographs, stripped entirely of the performed authority that had once filled every HOA meeting she'd ever chaired. Just a woman now, facing the consequences of choices made over more than a decade. She spoke first, carefully, clearly having rehearsed this moment many times. I've had a long time to understand what I actually did, she said. Not just legally. To people. Specifically. I used to tell myself I was protecting this community. I was protecting myself, and I let everyone else pay for it. I told her, honestly, that I appreciated hearing that without the usual qualifiers she'd once attached to every admission. But that understanding, however genuine, didn't erase the fear my daughter had carried for months, or the years other families had spent doubting their own eyes about a danger that was always, provably, real. I know, she said quietly. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I just needed you to know I finally see it clearly, without the excuses I used to hide behind. I believed her, mostly, understanding that some truths only become visible to a person once every alternative explanation has been exhausted. We spoke for nearly an hour, covering ground neither of us had ever addressed directly. The fines, the vandalism, Harold's original shortcuts, the lake house, the reserve fund, each subject smaller and less charged than I expected once finally spoken aloud in an ordinary room instead of buried under years of denial. Before I left, she asked one final question, hesitant, almost afraid of my answer. Do you think this community would have found its way to actual safety eventually, without any of this happening the way it did? I considered it honestly before answering. Maybe, I said.
But maybe isn't something you get.
She nodded slowly, accepting the answer without argument. Something I suspected the old Sandra never would have managed. As I stood to leave, she added one more thing. Emily tells me the wall still stands. Tell her I'm glad. If that means anything at all coming from me now. I told her I would pass along the message, though Emily and I already spoke regularly enough that she likely already knew. Walking out of that facility into ordinary daylight, I felt lighter than I expected, not because anything had been erased, but because something long unfinished had finally, honestly, been said aloud. Driving home, I thought about how differently this story might have ended if I'd given in, all those months earlier, torn the wall down just to escape the fines. And the vandalism and the exhausting social pressure of an entire neighborhood convinced I was the unreasonable one for wanting my family to survive a flood. I thought about Delgado's quiet warnings, about Walt's 20-year-old professional instinct finally validated, about Denise's careful courage risking her own reputation, about Emily choosing truth over easy loyalty, each person a small, necessary rivet in a structure far larger than any single wall I'd ever poured concrete for. Mara greeted me at the door that evening without asking many questions, simply hugging me for a long moment, sensing correctly that I needed quiet more than conversation. Lily, older now,
Taller.
ran up asking if I wanted to see the fort she'd built using scrap wood along the base of our wall. I followed her out back, examining her small, lopsided fort with exaggerated engineering seriousness, praising her footings, teasing her gently about load-bearing. Calculations she rolled her eyes at completely, both of us laughing under a clear evening sky that, for once, held absolutely no threat of rain at all. That night, after Lily finally fell asleep, Mara and I sat together on the porch, watching the river move calmly past in the distance, the same water that had once nearly taken everything from us now simply present. Ordinary, a neighbor rather than a threat. Exactly the relationship I'd always hoped we might eventually reach with it. You know, Mara said eventually, you never actually got an apology from the HOA itself. Just from her. I laughed softly. The rebuilt culverts are the apology, I said. The new bylaws are the apology. Every family that didn't flood this year is the apology. I don't need anyone's words on top of that. The following spring brought the neighborhood's third annual flood preparedness review. Now a genuine community tradition rather than a bureaucratic formality. Families gathering at the clubhouse to review updated forecasts, inspect drainage systems together, and, increasingly, simply catch up as neighbors who'd survived something difficult together and come out the other side intact. Delgado, still serving as board president by popular, repeated request, opened that meeting the same way he had for 2 years running. Remember, folks, he said, gesturing vaguely toward my direction across the room. Sometimes the ugliest thing in the neighborhood is the only thing standing between you and the bottom of the river. This time, the room laughed warmly rather than nervously, a joke fully absorbed into neighborhood folklore rather than a pointed reference to old wounds. And I found myself laughing along with everyone else. Genuinely, for what felt like the first time that particular joke had ever actually landed as pure affection instead of painful irony. Rick Hoyt, presenting the meeting's infrastructure update as the board's newly appointed safety liaison, walked through the culvert system's third consecutive successful storm season with the careful, thorough competence of a man who'd clearly spent considerable personal time studying the exact subject he'd once dismissed entirely at Sandra's insistence. I sat in the back that evening, Mara beside me, Lily fidgeting with a coloring book 2 seats over. Watching a neighborhood that had once nearly destroyed my family over an aesthetic complaint now function, imperfectly but genuinely, as the kind of community my father had never quite gotten the chance to grow old within. Emily texted partway through the meeting a photo of her own coursework. A floodplain policy proposal citing Willow Creek's transparency reforms as a primary case study. Captioned simply, "Still building on what happened here. Some good came out of all of it after all." I smiled reading it in the dim clubhouse light. After the meeting adjourned, small groups of neighbors lingered in the parking lot the way people do after something meaningful rather than merely obligatory, comparing notes on gardens, on kids, on ordinary life. The desperate urgency of that first flooded spring finally, fully, settled into something closer to peaceful, hard-won routine. Walking to our car, Mara slipped her hand into mine, and I glanced back once at the clubhouse, at the neighbors gathered under its lights, at the community that had called my wall an eyesore and then, eventually, its own quiet salvation, understanding finally that some fights are worth every fine, every insult, every sleepless night. In the years that followed, Willow Creek's culvert system, transparency bylaws, and annual preparedness review became a quietly cited model whenever the county discussed floodplain governance. My original engineering documents occasionally referenced, anonymously, in training materials for new HOA boards learning what genuine community safety actually required of its leadership. Sandra was released early on parole for good behavior roughly 2 years later, choosing, according to Emily, to relocate entirely out of state rather than return anywhere near the community whose trust she'd spent over a decade quietly, methodically betraying for the sake of appearances and a lake house she no longer owned. Rick Hoyt served 2 full terms on the new board before stepping aside voluntarily, telling neighbors at his final meeting that watching the culverts hold through 3 consecutive major storms had taught him everything he ever needed to understand about the actual difference between leadership and mere authority. My wall stood through every storm season that followed, its concrete weathered gray beneath Lily's now fully mature flowering vines, no longer discussed as scandal or symbol, simply present, simply functional, simply, finally, exactly what it had always been meant to be from the very first day I poured its foundation. Years later, watching Lily leave for college, I walked the length of that wall one last quiet morning before the movers arrived, tracing footings I'd poured with my own 2 hands during the hardest year of my adult life, grateful, finally, uncomplicatedly, that it had never once needed to be tested again the way that first storm demanded. Some neighbors call it the ugly wall to this day. Fondly now, a nickname worn smooth with years of affectionate use. And I've stopped minding entirely, understanding at last that the ugliest things, built honestly, for the right reasons, are often exactly what quietly saves everyone who once mocked them. The end.